And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Let's continue our Sermon on the Mount series with the Beatitudes. If you're not familiar with that term, the Beatitudes are the blessed are verses at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew chapter 5. Verses 3 through 10 are the 8 agreed upon Beatitudes, with verse 11 and 12 being the disputed, 9th or 10th. But today, we will talk about the entire Beatitudes passage, regardless of any arguments around the last two statements being Beatitudes or not. That's more of a seminary or academic distinction that might be fun, but let's just get into the message from Jesus. And don't forget what we've learned from our introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. If you're just joining me in this conversation, I'd like to invite you to check out episode 61 for our introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. And you might be interested in episode 62 that focuses on pacifism, since that is a common topic dealing with a lot of the things Jesus brings up in the Sermon on the Mount. So if you haven't listened to those episodes yet, but want to, go ahead, pause this, download them, check them out, and I'll be here when you get back. Alright, if you're ready to go with the Beatitudes, I'd like to keep these questions in mind as we encounter these blessed are statements. What did the Beatitudes mean for the listener? What did Jesus mean by each of these statements? And most specifically to us, what are we to do with these statements in our Christian anarchism discussions? But first things first, let's read through the first 12 verses of the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Seeing the crowds, he went up to the mountain. When he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In the introduction episode, I read from a sermon that was given by Martin Lloyd-Jones and was transcribed in his book, Studies in the Sermon on the Mount. He also has a sermon for each one of these Beatitudes. I'll try my best to hit on some important points on each one, but spend a little more attention on the points that get brought up in our discussions about politics or social justice. In one of his sermons, that is an introduction to the Beatitudes, Lloyd-Jones makes the point that it is important to see the whole of the Beatitudes before jumping into the individual parts. he points out 4 general lessons for the reader of the Beatitudes. First, that all Christians are supposed to be like this. It's important to see that these are characteristics of a Christian and not just a description of certain Christians that hold religious offices and titles. The second principle is that all Christians are meant to manifest all of these characteristics. It isn't that some are meant to be poor in spirit while others are meant to be peacemakers, while others are meant to be merciful, and so on. A Christian is to exhibit all of the characteristics. The third principle is that none of these descriptions refer to natural tendency. Jones says that it is vitally important to understand this principle, and to understand that each one of these characteristics is wholly a disposition, which is produced by grace alone and the operation of the Holy Spirit upon us. The fourth, he says that the characteristics in the Beatitudes are the essential, utter difference between a Christian and the non-Christian. These characteristics of the Christian in the Beatitudes are different than that of the world's. Meekness, poor in spirit, being persecuted. These are not traits that get you ahead in the world or garner wealth and influence. So as we start to look at these parts, let's keep these characteristics in mind and know that these are characteristics and not commands. It helps when understanding these principles. And similar to what Jones said in the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, these characteristics are for the Christian now, not of a Christian in heaven or a millennial utopia. The first beatitude is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." An interesting thing I see with this one is that it is commonly shortened to, "Blessed are the poor." When that happens, it is usually done possibly unintentionally, confusing it with another verse in Luke, but taken out of context nonetheless, usually to drive an economic ideology. It's common among the socialist-minded Christians and is used to further a narrative that has Jesus only concerned with social justice. First, this is a detriment because it hijacks the message of what Jesus says here and cheapens the gospel. Also, it's unnecessary. Christ, as well as many writers in the Bible, tell us over and again to give to the poor. We do not need to make this verse part of that. But just to show a few, Proverbs 19:17 tells us, "Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed." Hebrews 13:16, "Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." 2 Corinthians 9:7 tells us that God loves a cheerful giver. 1 John 3:17 asks, "But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him?" Acts 20:35 quotes Jesus saying it is better to give than to receive. And later in Matthew 5, verse 42, Jesus tells us to give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. See, there are a ton of verses about giving to the needy, and this being a proper action from Christians, there isn't really much dispute, and I don't think I need to make the case. I just think it's important to note that this beatitude is not about that. Martin Lloyd-Jones said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit" is necessarily first in this list of beatitudes. He says that it is a fundamental characteristic of the Christian and all other characteristics flow from it. But if it isn't speaking about monetary wealth, what is it speaking of? The poor or poverty in spirit speaks to man's attitude towards himself. It's the antithesis of prideful and self-centered messages we usually hear. Self-confidence, self-reliance, and self-assurance. But of course, this isn't the physical means like being able to survive on your own. This is in the spiritual context, and it plays out in what Lloyd Jones calls the fatal assumption that by acts of parliament alone, you can produce a perfect society, and the tragic confidence that the power of education and knowledge as such to save men, to transform them and make them into decent human beings. Blessed are those that mourn isn't generally brought up in our discussions about being anti state. But it's important to remember that it is a spiritual extension from being poor in spirit. We should be encouraged to mourn when we are not poor in spirit, when we sin, or when we see sin in the world. So this beatitude can be applied to social issues, and we can mourn when we see, as Lloyd Jones puts it, unhappiness and suffering of mankind, and when we read of wars and rumors of wars. But also be encouraged. The last half of this beatitude promises that those who mourn will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, is directly relevant to our stateless discussions. The opposite of meek is everything that statism and nationalism encourages. Lloyd Jones puts it this way: the world thinks in terms of strength and power, of ability, self-assurance, and aggressiveness. That is the world's idea of conquest and possession. He also notes that this would be particularly a great shock to the Jews that were listening to the Sermon on the Mount and who read the Gospel of Matthew. And it's something that is very similar to the Jews that were waiting on the Messiah then and the American Christian today. He explains they had ideas of the kingdom which, you remember, were not only materialistic, but military also. And to them, the Messiah was one who was going to lead them to victory. So they were thinking in terms of conquest and fighting in a material sense. So meekness is the opposite of trusting in institutions and shows of strength. There are people in the Bible that we can draw from as examples of meekness, but Christ's example is truly the true and perfect example. Lloyd Jones calls Christ mild, gentle, lowly, and the most approachable person ever seen. Meekness isn't about weakness. As we discussed in the pacifism episode, acts of love and nonviolence in the face of persecution and violence can show an even greater strength. 1 Peter 2:21 through 23 gives us this picture of it perfectly. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. And to really drive it home, Jones puts it like this: we are to leave everything, ourselves, our rights, our cause, our whole future, in the hands of God, and especially so if we feel we are suffering unjustly. We learn to say with the Apostle Paul that our policy must be this: vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. We need not repay, we just deliver ourselves into the hands of God. The Lord will revenge, he will repay. We have nothing to do. We leave ourselves and our cause and our rights and everything with God, with a quietness in spirit and in mind and heart. And if you think these definitions of meekness don't really have any relevance to the militarism and conquest mentioned earlier, don't forget about the last half. The meek will inherit the earth. This is why militarism should be pointed out when we are addressing this beatitude. We Christians will not inherit the earth by conversion through legislation, nor crusades. So the next beatitude isn't usually a part of our conversations, but maybe it should be. Let me start with the first paragraph of Martin Lloyd-Jones' sermon on righteousness and blessedness. The Christian's concern is to view life in this world in the light of the gospel. And according to the gospel, the trouble with mankind is not any one particular manifestation of sin, but rather sin itself. If you are anxious about the state of the world and the threat of possible wars, then I assure you that the most direct way of avoiding such calamities is to observe words such as these, which we are now considering. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. If every man and woman in this world knew what it was to hunger and to thirst after righteousness, there would be no danger of war. Here is the only way to real peace. All other considerations eventually do not touch the problem, and all the denunciations that are so constantly made of various countries and people and persons will not have the slightest effect upon the internal situation. Thus, we often waste our time and God's time in expressing our human thoughts and sentiments instead of considering His Word. If every human being knew what it was to hunger and thirst after righteousness, the problem would be solved. The greatest need in the world now is for a greater number of Christians, individual Christians. If all nations consisted of individual Christians, there would be no need to fear atomic power or anything else. So the gospel, which seems to be so remote and indirect in its approach, is actually the most direct way of solving the problems. One of the greatest tragedies in the life of the church today is the way in which so many are content with these vague, general, useless statements about war and peace instead of preaching the gospel in all its simplicity and purity. It is righteousness that exalts a nation, and the most important thing for all of us is to discover what righteousness means. Lloyd Jones then takes the majority of his sermon to show what righteousness isn't. After that, he does an amazing job of showing its relation to justification and sanctification, and really drives home that righteousness ultimately means a desire to be free from sin and get back to a relationship with God before sin and rebellion. He sums up this characteristic as showing the fruits of the Spirit in every action and in the whole of his life. And in case you're not familiar with that phrase, the fruits of the Spirit, it can be found in Galatians 5:22 through 23. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, which in short is to be just like Christ. Blessed are the merciful always strikes me as something completely left to empty rhetoric today. We say it in church, in Sunday school, we write it in pretty art, but mercy is a distant thing when we start talking about justice, retribution, or foreign policy. So what is mercy? I like the distinction that Martin Lloyd-Jones brings up. He shows us grace and mercy as two different things while referencing verses like 2 John chapter 1, verse 3. He says that grace is especially associated with men in their sin. Mercy is especially associated with men in their misery. He says that mercy is a sense of pity and a desire to relieve suffering. He also points out that an example of having a merciful spirit means the spirit that is displayed when you suddenly find yourself in a position of having in your power someone who has transgressed against you. Now, the way you know you are merciful or not is to consider how you feel towards that person. Are you going to say, well, now, I am going to exert my rights at this point. I am going to be legal. The person has transgressed against me. Very well, here comes the opportunity. That is the very antithesis of being merciful. This person is in your power. Is there a vindictive spirit, or is there a spirit of pity and sorrow? A spirit, if you like, of kindness to your enemies in distress. Or again, we can describe it as inward sympathy and outward acts in relation to the sorrows and sufferings of others. He then gives examples from parables and Jesus' incarnation and work on the cross. And when we see the mercy Jesus had for us, we see others with a Christian eye. He says, I see them as dupes and the victims and the slaves of sin and Satan and of the way of the world. I have come to not simply see them as men whom I dislike, but as men to be pitied. I have come to see them as being governed by the God of this world, as being still where I once was, and would be yet, but for the grace of God. I differentiate between the sinner and his sin. I see everybody who is in a state of sin as one who is to be pitied. Blessed are the pure in heart isn't ever brought up as far as I could tell. It's obviously important scripturally. The heart is something we are shown over and over that sin flows from, and Jesus tells us that sin committed in our hearts are just as damning as committing sin physically. As well, seeing that God is the result of having a pure heart. I'm not going to spend any more time on this beatitude because it doesn't really come up in this political context that we're focusing on. But I don't want that to be mistaken for disregarding it. It's a very important study, and I hope everyone will take some time to look further into it. But the next one is a big one. Blessed are the peacemakers. How many times have you seen this applied to police support memes or artwork or home decorations? I kid you not, I've even seen gun holsters with thin blue lines and this beatitude printed on them. I'm really at a loss for words at how utterly ridiculous it is to militarize being a peacemaker. On its surface, at this point in time, it seems completely illogical to mix these two concepts, being a peacemaker with validating aggressive and deadly behavior, intimidation, and coercion. But with just a little thought, we can easily see how this all started. It's not unusual to look at forms of police over the ages and throughout fiction or myth to see this idea of peacekeepers. The Wild West Sheriff, the Jedi in Star Wars, the Knights of King Arthur. I imagine it is a normal feeling for people that get into these positions, so it seems natural to adopt the title. The Colt revolver from the late 1800s was called the Peacemaker, and it's still an affectionate term for self-defense with a handgun today. In one way, I can see this. If the world were that childish. I mean, the peacekeeping, do-gooding knights of King Arthur and Star Wars are generally a good myth for children to aspire to, concerned with the welfare of others and protecting communities at the risk of their own life. But as we hit the tales with a dose of reality, we see the tendency for the peacemaker to be violent, vengeful, and to seek power. Such is the case in this heavily militarized police state today. It takes a strong case of cognitive dissonance to not see the absolute abuse from police on a daily basis. Whether it's policing for profit through nonviolent crimes, or targeting people based off of social status or skin color, or just flat out flexing their authority. Policing today has become thuggish. Yet people still apply that juvenile facade of keeping or making peace. Again, I'm at a loss for words because even if you ignore the videos of police brutality, how do we not see the tactical and militarization of police across every state and every city, urban and rural? And in case anyone hasn't heard it yet, if you have your come and take it with an AR-15 flag flying next to your thin blue line flag, who do you think is going to come and take it? It's not Iran. and it's not the Russians, and it's not the Democrats. If you have your Don't Tread on Me flag flying next to your Back the Blue flag, who do you think is going to tread on you? It's not the politicians, it's their law enforcers, it's their police. Anyways, that was a bit of a rant. Let's get into what being a peacemaker means, if it's not all of that. What does a peacemaker look like? Turning to Martin Lloyd-Jones again, he points out 4 practices that are part of becoming a peacemaker. He says that 1, we must learn not to speak. 2, you must think. 3, you must become positive and look for ways to make peace. And lastly, 4, we should endeavor to diffuse peace wherever possible. I think before reading his thoughts on this beatitude, I would have had trouble explaining my thoughts on how to be a peacemaker, how to describe it. But the way he puts it, it seems very simple and obvious to anyone once we read it. So, number 1, not to speak, references James 1:19, when he tells us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. This is something that can be outside of our natural inclinations, especially if we or a loved one are in a position that is confrontational. 2, when we think. Lloyd-Jones suggests that when we are in a situation that leads to trouble, we should view everything in the context of the gospel and ask a few questions like this. What are the implications of this? What about the cause? What about all the people who are dependent? He also says the moment we think like this, we are beginning to make peace. But as long as you are thinking of it in a personal sense, there will be war. 3, actively looking for methods to make peace echoes verses like Romans 12:20 and Proverbs 25:21. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. Also, doing this actively and positively means humbling ourselves, going out and approaching people, apologizing, trying to be friendly, doing everything we can to produce peace. 4, Lloyd-Jones defines diffusing peace as being completely selfless. When we are selfless, people will want to approach us to bring peace to their thoughts and situations, even if we might be a part of the issue. The next couple of verses deals with persecution, specifically in verse 10, the blessed are those that are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And verse 11, the blessed are those that are reviled and persecuted and lied about on Jesus' account. It's going to look like I'm talking about these verses on persecution by lumping these last few verses together, but don't make the mistake that they're just repetitive. A lot can be gained by focusing on each of these separately. A couple of things to look at in these persecutions is that they are in the context of our faith in Christ and acting like Christ, by exhibiting the previous Beatitudes we already went over. So we should understand that this blessing isn't just talking about persecution for any cause, and there is no one way for the persecution to come upon any of us. Sometimes it is from a neighbor, and sometimes it is from the state. I will include links to the episodes on the Barmen Declaration leading up to World War II and Pastor Wang Yi's declaration of faithful disobedience from China just a few years ago. Getting back to Martin Lloyd-Jones, he notes that persecution can take the form of men being shot or murdered, a man losing his job, sneering, jeering, and laughter as we enter a room, or a whisper campaign. I'm sure everyone can think back to when they've experienced some of these things, or even participated. Lloyd-Jones notes that we must not do 3 things when we encounter these persecutions. We must not retaliate, we must not feel resentment, and we must never be depressed by it. Further into the Sermon on the Mount, we will encounter more verses that show very specific ways that we could encounter enemies or persecution, and specific actions that we should do when that happens. A lot of those actions, as well as the general scope, will be an extension of the previous pacifism episode I've already mentioned, and we'll have a link to in the show notes. But one thing we shouldn't forget from verse 12 here: rejoice and be glad. Now, this was something like 12 sermons that I've condensed, and I assure you, while I think I highlighted relevant points, I didn't do justice to Martin Lloyd-Jones's deep work on the whole of the Beatitudes. So, I will have a link to this book in the show notes. If anyone is looking to get a deeper dive, I very much recommend it. And if you purchase it through the Amazon link that I provide, Anarcho-Christian will get a small commission at no additional expense to you. There is also a podcast that's a free audiobook that I'll find the link to and have it on there for you as well. One last interesting thing on the Beatitudes: Luke records 4 of these from the lesser recognized Sermon on the Plain. This takes place in Luke chapter 6, verse 20 through 22. We see, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man." And verse 23 includes the rejoicing part: "Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers did to the prophets." The Beatitudes are words to reflect on and be encouraged by. These are promises of being blessed for those exhibiting, practicing, and enduring these things mentioned in the Beatitudes. It's not a list of laws that we accomplish so that we might earn blessings. If you are experiencing persecution for righteousness' sake, then we can take that as confirmation that we are His and will be satisfied, comforted, receive mercy, see God, have the kingdom of heaven, and a great reward in heaven. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon or Subscribestar, or a one-time donation through PayPal. You can visit us on those sites, or you can visit the Support the Show tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to a page where you'll find links to Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. Thank you, Davis, Sean, and Thomas, for your support this month. And since we are finishing up 2020, I want to thank everyone again for your support. In addition to Davis, Sean, and Thomas, thank you to everyone who supported and stuck with me through 2020. Paul, Cheon, Patrick, Paul, Scott, Devin, Tom, JR, Tom, Scott, Jonathan, Al, Jesse, Darren, Anton, Daniel, Thomas, David, Amy, Barrett, Jarvis, Emily, James, Jared, Joseph, Nick, Ben, Matt, Joseph, Scott, Nathaniel, Madcap, Mortuary Podcast, Peter, Craig, Joseph, Leonardo, James, and Josh. It was a tough year for me, and I know it was for a lot of you as well. I really can't express how much your support encourages me, as well as helping financially with the podcast and the website. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. Happy New Year. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God. Don't you help them to believe this power is illusion. The need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
Seeing the crowds, he went up to the mountain. When he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.